terrorists. If we're going to address the challenge of their efforts to recruit,
it is vital that we win the propaganda war.
Make no mistake, this was a terrorist attack.
Welcome to Extreme Calls, the podcast where you learn about extremist communications and propaganda. My name is Stefan Bale from the University of Exeter. And today we look at the propaganda set up by the so-called self-proclaimed Islamic State. Islamic State's gruesome videos have shocked the world, and most of us know that the organization was, or is, extremely active on the social media. But what most people don't realize is how extensive and sophisticated the group's propaganda was. IS propaganda was an important milestone in extremist communications, which is why we dedicate this extreme call to it.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and incite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet.
To ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility.
And to do so, it is my great pleasure to have with me Charlie Winter, one of the world's most knowledgeable experts on Islamic State communications. Charlie, welcome and thanks to take part in this Extreme Calls.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
So Charlie, you are a senior research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, and you conduct research on terrorism and insurgency with a focus on online and offline strategic communications. You particularly examine how militant groups cultivate creative approaches to governance and war, and alongside work at ICSR, which is supported by Facebook as part of the Online Civil Courage Initiative, you are an associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague and an associate of the Imperial War Museum Institute in London. So I would like to start with a very brief question on yourself. How can you briefly tell us how you came to study something like this, Islamic State communications, your kind of intellectual journey, very briefly?
Yeah, sure. So I studied Arabic as my undergraduate degree and kind of did Middle Eastern studies and Islamic studies alongside that. I spent quite a lot of time out in Syria back in 2010, 2011 as well. So I was living there for a year in Damascus when the revolution and then civil war started. So I kind of, from very early on in my kind of after school academic interests, I became very interested in terrorism, in insurgency, especially jihadism, and especially in the context of Syria. So I carried on reading about, writing about that part of the world, that set of issues, and just found myself on a path where I was looking more and more at the kind of strategic logic behind the materials that were dictating the news agenda around Syria, around terrorism and insurgency in Syria. Became very fascinated by that, and while there's a fair few researchers who were interested in it too, yourself included, but it was still an area that was ripe for a few contributions. So I started and then haven't really stopped since.
Excellent. And so in terms of these communications, and I think we're going to narrow immediately here to keep the discussion focused on the so-called self-proclaimed Islamic State. Yeah. So let's start with a very general question. Can you tell our audience what exactly the so-called Islamic State is, or maybe we should say IS or ISIS or Daesh, and also, can you describe, the main line, the main tenets of the Islamic State's propaganda machine? Because that's it's a big system, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly. It's a big system, but it's a lot less big than it was a few years ago. So I'll get onto that in a second. So first of all, I call it the Islamic State in this particular setting. I think it just it's for sake of ease, but I can completely see why people would rather call it Daesh or ISIS or what have you. But it's just my personal preference for an academic setting. But the Islamic State I see as a tripartite organization or movement. So we have the proto-state, or the kind of in theater insurgency aspect of it, which is preeminent in places like Syria and Iraq, but also increasingly in West Africa as well. So that's the kind of day-to-day fighting and insurgency using asymmetric warfare to achieve political effect, and communicate with local populations, recruit from local populations, and also target local populations. That is the kind of the core element of the Islamic State today. Then on top of that, we have the Islamic State as a hierarchically organized, internationally active terrorist organization. So this is still part and parcel of the same thing, but with a different set of objectives and priorities and operating mechanisms as well. So this aspect of the Islamic State was behind, for example, the attacks in Paris back in 2015, behind a long string of other attacks, but crucially not those which have been driven by supporters, the stabbing attacks, the vehicular attacks, that sort of thing, which hasn't been necessarily organized and directed by the Islamic State outside of its immediate sphere of operations. Okay. That aspect of the group is what I see as the kind of social movement, the global jihadi idea that the Islamic State is grounded on. And that's a much more nebulous and intangible aspect of the organization. And it is essentially the set of ideas, the imperatives, the creed and methodology of the group that people orientate themselves within before embarking on supporter-driven and often low impact but high visibility terrorist attacks outside of its immediate sphere of operations in places like Iraq and Syria and so on. You also asked about its propaganda. So yeah. As you say, it's a very big operation, and I would go as far as saying that until recently we hadn't seen something on the scale as on the same scale as the Islamic State's media infrastructure in the context of insurgency ever before. Just back in 2015, when it was at its height, publishing thousands of photographs every single month, thousands of operation claims, daily news bulletins, a few videos every single day. I mean, it was a very formidable bit of kit. Today, we're looking at maybe 1 or 2 photo essays in a single day, so a handful of photos, often none at all. No more than 15, 20, perhaps 30 news bulletins as well. If you're if you're lucky, if you're an Islamic State supporter, perhaps 1 or 2 videos every fortnight. It's much diminished. But again, the uniformity, the branding, the coherence, the strategy is still there. They're still thinking very carefully about how to communicate with their target audiences. But I think the core objective has changed tack as the situational exigencies that the Islamic State faces in places like Iraq and Syria have altered course in the last few years. So the last thing I'll say is that back in 2014, 2015, and much of 2016, I think that there was indeed a lot of Islamic State propaganda that was geared towards the principal aim of propagating the ideology, essentially getting people involved in the group and eventually recruiting. Nowadays, I think the majority of its materials is more geared towards retaining current supporters, so retention rather than recruitment, keeping the organization, the movement, the ideology coherent and unified as a global entity.
Yeah, so there have been, so if I understand correctly, there was really a huge propaganda system, but that has shrunk, but also it was a varied propaganda system with a series of different outputs that were produced. So You mentioned the photographs, the videos, and one output that I think, when I look at the literature or the sort of the expert reports on this propaganda, one output that I think has been studied maybe the most are the magazines. Yeah. So I'm thinking about magazines written in English, like the magazine called Dabiq and another magazine called Rumiyah that comes after, but also the Arabic speaking magazine Al-Naba to a lesser extent. It's really hard even to keep count on the academic studies on these magazines. Can you tell us a little bit more about these magazines and why there's so much attention to these magazines, and what do we know by now with all these studies, investigating these magazines?
So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think of all of the aspects of the Islamic State's propaganda over the last few years, it's its magazines, its publications that have been the most heavily studied. And of that, it is the English language ones far and away that have been looked at most closely, whether it's linguistic analyses or visual analyses or kind of broader discourse analyses. It's very much these publications that have borne the most attention from academics and scholars looking at these issues. I think one clear reason for that is they are accessible. They're English language, they're easy to get hold of. There's quite a small number of them. While there are many tens of thousands of words, probably hundreds of thousands in total, there's only a few dozen issues in total. So that makes quite a nice sample for assessment. And also because they've been spaced out over a fairly significant period of time, it means that there's room for comparative analysis in there as well. I think that the literature generally has tackled the magazines from a few different directions. I'd say probably the most common conclusion that people reach in relation to them is that there is a very clear set of editorial principles and stylistic motifs that are borrowed from dominant visual culture, dominant editorial publication culture outside of the context of whether it's jihadism or the Middle East or what have you. So there's been a lot of discussion of that. They've been mined for insights into the broader ideology of Salafi jihadism as well. A lot has been written about the kind of provocation logic and the retribution justification of targeting of non-combatants based on these magazines. There's been a fair few articles written about the photographs that appear within their pages. So whether they depict scenes of violence or civilian life and how that changes with time. So a lot of interesting stuff has been done. I do think that there's a bit of a problem though, with the fact that there has been so much written about these magazines and so much less written about the other materials. And I say that as someone who has written about the Arabic language newsletter Al-Naba myself, so I'm part of the problem. But I think that while it is very useful to have lots of studies looking at these things, I don't think they're representative necessarily of the entirety of the Islamic State's media infrastructure. I don't think they're necessarily representative of what drives its production of propaganda. I don't think they're representative of how it engages in interpersonal outreach within its immediate sphere of operations. So how its da'wah or proselytization officials actually go out and talk to people and try to seal some sort of interdependence between them as civilians and it as an insurgent organization. So I think, in short, while it's very useful that we know so much about Dabiq and Rumiyah and so on, I worry that because attention has been so focused on them, that's come at the expense of other media, like its photographs, its music, even its videos, which are kind of paradoxically probably the most notorious items of propaganda that is published over the last few years because of the attention they receive in news media, but probably one of the most understudied aspect as well, because they are almost always published in Arabic.
Yes, and so let's talk a little bit about these videos, because I think I have two questions about them. So it seems like they are, as you said, they are understudied, and yet they constitute a very important, perhaps more representative type of output from Islamic State propaganda. But certainly, if I hear your argument about the magazines correctly, we can have the flip side of it, which is that the videos are I guess, very, very hard to analyze. I mean, it's not like you have a very neat PDF with a magazine and then you can sort of scrape the content immediately and analyze it. Analyzing videos is very difficult. Do you have there? So my first question would be on these videos, and then I keep a second one for slightly later. This one is very short. Do you have in mind some? Do we have some knowledge about these videos? Have there been some studies that highlight some important themes or features or about these videos? What do we know about them?
That's a good question. There have been a number of academic papers written about videos, but the vast majority of them focus on a selection of videos rather than a sample of either randomly selected videos or an exhaustive sample of videos from a given place at a given time. So because these studies have been grounded on the researchers' personal selection of the videos in question, I think that has meant that while they're still very interesting bits of work that do give us insights regarding the videos that are being studied in that particular paper or article, it does mean that, again, they are not necessarily indicative of the whole, even though they may be still useful and interesting. And
can I interrupt you
sorry, go on.
Very quickly. So can you give us some kind of idea of how much there is in terms of videos? Because you seem to say that they have published loads and loads of videos. It's what, in the hundreds, in the thousands, in the tens of thousands?
So it would be so for the last 5 years, there are well over 1,500 videos produced by the provincial media offices of the Islamic State. So these are the Islamic State organizationally is broken down into different wilayat, and
different provinces. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And each of them has nominally, but not in reality, I think, its own media office, which is charged with producing and packaging photo reports and videos, and then those are the things that get published on places like Telegram today. But in addition to those videos produced by the Wilayat Media Office, there's also many hundreds, probably thousands of video clips that are produced by the Al-Mark News Agency. So this is something which is an auxiliary media foundation that is very much part and parcel of the Islamic State media infrastructure, but it professes to be operating in parallel to the organization rather than at its behest. And on a day-to-day basis, not so much these days, there's a handful of Al-Mark videos every week, but back a few years ago, there were 3, perhaps 4 Al-Mark News Agency video clips popping up every day. Those ones would be very different from the videos produced by the provinces. They would be 30, 40 seconds in length, often less, as opposed to 15, 20 minutes, sometimes 30 or 40 minutes in length. So there's a huge degree of variation within just this one subset of the media landscape. And that's the thing that I think could be better captured, or we need to better capture, the fact that there is a very diverse ecosystem of video content here. But it's difficult. There's hundreds of hours of footage in total. And as you say, methodologically, it's a lot more difficult to analyze a video than it is to analyze a nice, almost pre-prepared corpus of English language text. but we do have the increasingly have the capabilities to do that. So whether it's using Google software to transcribe the narration and content of the videos themselves from an audio perspective, and then do some sort of analysis based on that transcribed text, or whether it's, I mean, there's a kind of blossoming use of visual semiotics in the context of especially jihadist communication in particular, so that could be applied more readily. I think one aspect that I've spoken with Corey Dauber and Mark Robinson over at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill about is doing some sort of audio analysis of the videos, because I mean, of the analyses that do exist in relation to the videos, often they look at things like editorial style and technique, and the sorts of tropes and motifs that emerge and are borrowed from Western contexts, among others, or Arab cinema, for example. But something that we don't really think about is how sound effects are used in order to augment the process of conveying meaning through these videos. And that would be something that would be a really fascinating project to do. It's just, I mean, the one thing about the content produced by the Islamic State is, I mean, even today when it's at a comparatively very low ebb, there's still so much of it. There's so much data out there. There's so many interesting rabbit holes to go down. So trying to figure out how to, sorry, can you hear that?
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Okay, sorry. Trying to figure out how to, which rabbit hole is worth traveling down and what to prioritize at any one time is a real challenge. But certainly there's lots of interesting stuff out there, interesting opportunities that we can go down as researchers to try to unearth insights that haven't already been unearthed and perhaps aren't just at the kind of superficial reaches of the organization.
Yes, and so in terms of the video, still, just my second question would be on one of the aspects of the videos that I think is the one that people know about, really, is the fact that they contain really gruesome stuff, shootings, right? So you have executions, you have punishments videos when, you know, people have their hands cut off or have been, you know, are executed. So we have the media has relayed also, and maybe there is a role of the media here, has relayed depictions of videos where people are burnt or drowned or exploded. So it seems like gruesomeness is a key element of the Islamic State videos. It seems to make absolutely no sense for the general public, right? But surely it must have a sense. What's your take on that?
So yeah, I mean, there is some really appalling content in there, and it is often delivered with not just attention to detail, but someone has really thought very carefully about how to capture someone being beheaded as closely as possible, or how to capture the sound effects. Just really grim stuff that that is quite appalling to think about, that someone has spent time trying to deliver as gruesome an offering as possible. But the principal reason behind that, and there are obviously a lot of them, but as I see it, the principal reason behind this kind of subset of its content is not something that we can really understand in isolation of everything else that the Islamic State produces and the rest of its narrative. At the very heart of its ideological kind of offering to its supporters is an opposition between Muslims and non-Muslims, between Islam and un-Islam, or Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. So the kind of two abodes that are in cosmic and eternal war with each other. This opposition is being actualized in the course of these videos of extreme violence. It's the Islamic State. It's the which professes to be a representative of Islam, of Muslims, Sunni Muslims, that is, the world over. They show the Islamic State rectifying what it considers to be an imbalance, wherein non-Muslims have had the edge on the Muslim world for many centuries now, and this is Islam essentially getting its own back and rectifying this imbalance. The particular way in which people are killed, whether it's being burned alive or drowned or shot or driven over with a tank, there's a symbolism to all of that stuff. Those decisions are made because they are considered to be symbolically effective at conveying that narrative, but also to have the ability to immediately demonstrate to the viewer that this is the Islamic State seeking very targeted retribution. So whether it's the Jordanian pilot's a good example of this, back in 2015 when he was burned alive, and then rubble was piled on top of his corpse. That was meant to simulate an airstrike or a building being bombed and the inhabitants of that building being burned alive, and then having the building collapse on them. There's a symbolism to it that was chosen very, very deliberately, and it's all about demonstrating that the Islamic State is rectifying in a very targeted and literal way the perceived crimes that are being imparted upon its supporters.
Right. So in a way, they're kind of for the Jordanian pilot, because when you explained that, it's the example also that sprang to my mind. So because he was a pilot and he was engaged in airstrikes, they were quite keen, if I understand you correctly, to then kind of punish him the way he was oppressing and victimizing Muslims. Is that what you're saying? And so they did to him what he did to the Muslims beforehand, according to them. Yeah. Yeah,
that's right. And in other contexts, I mean, there was a video from early 2016 where a group of men who had been accused of espionage on behalf of the Global Coalition were killed in a series of different ways, but one of the ones that springs to mind is explosives were essentially fixed to the laptop that he would use to communicate. So no, not the head. God, this is a horrible conversation to have. But they were fixed to the laptop that he had been accused of using to communicate with I think it was Jordanian intelligence, and then they were detonated while he was filmed, kind of using that laptop. And it was again, I mean, it was awful, but from a symbolic perspective, that's the Islamic State was really trying to spell out for viewers what this individual was being executed for at the very moment of his execution. And of course, it's not always so blatant, not always so literal, but that notion of direct retribution and targeted retribution is conveyed all the time in these materials.
Okay, so that makes more sense. And can I have a very quick question that before we carry on? It's kind of parenthesis, but you're a specialist of all this, and you seem to know all these videos very, very, very well. I'm wondering a little bit about the psychology of this from a researcher point of view. Surely watching videos like that and knowing that real people are being burned or whatever, does it take its toll, or do you have mechanisms and strategies to not to be hit too hard by these images, which can be very vivid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since the end of 2014, I haven't watched an execution happening in full. I don't think there's analytical value in watching the actual moment that someone is killed. And given we're watching all these videos either on our phones or on our laptops, it's very easy to skip to immediately before and immediately after an execution. So that's one kind of very simple thing that I've been doing since, well, for last Christ 6 years now, which
Yeah.
has been, I think, something I'm thankful for. But I mean, more broadly in the kind of research process and just being aware of potential risk of trauma is something which I've been thinking about a lot for years now, because this is really troubling and awful stuff to work with, even though the kind of suffering that we're potentially party to or at risk of being exposed to is obviously nothing compared to what people faced who actually had to live under this group. But there's a few different, there's techniques when it comes to actually watching the materials. So trying to ensure that you remain separated from the content itself, whether that's by watching it in a small screen, so the rest of what's around you and around it is still very clear to see, to keep you grounded and aware that this is something which is removed from where you are and what you're doing. Watching without volume is another thing that's been recommended so that a couple of things like that were drawn from manuals or kind of advice guidelines given to journalists working with traumatic materials. But then also I find that just analyzing the logic behind this content, or trying to describe and then assess or evaluate the reason for which videos like this make sense to a group like the Islamic State, that has also been something that has been a useful kind of practice for me, because not that it does anything other than allows me to process the content itself and what it means, and also what it means to me. So there's basically a few different things. I think they have worked for me so far, but I mean, God knows what happens in 10 years or whatever. But certainly it's something that I think is something that anyone working with these materials should be thinking very carefully about. They do it, yeah.
Okay, so let's perhaps move away from these videos, although they are a very important component. Do you see other components that we should talk about? So we've discussed magazines, videos, but surely there's much more. I think, pictures you mentioned, but also music. You mentioned some songs. It seems like there's a lot. Can you kind of have some kind of list for our listeners to kind of be aware of, the full range, and perhaps single out one or two things that really are important to know about?
Yeah, sure. So we've spoken about the publications and videos. The music, so what I'm referring to there is the Anashid that are published by the Ajned Foundation, which is the in-house Islamic State authority charged with producing the music that accompanies that you can hear accompanying videos, but also that is featured in the run-up to audio statements from leaders and whatnot, but also that are published as standalone MP3 files for supporters to listen to. So Anashid have been written about by a few academics over the last few years. Behnam Saeed has done some good stuff, and there's a researcher up in Norway, Henrik Ratrud, I'm sure I mispronounced his name there, but who's done some really good stuff on Anashid as well, looking at the significance of the medium as its own kind of thing, as its own manifestation of jihadi communication, but also the cultural significance as well. So there's a nasheed for every occasion, whether it's one to be listened to prior to going to battle, whether it's geared towards inciting violence, whether it's about the supremacy and triumphalism of the Islamic State, whether it's about the crimes that are being imparted upon civilian Muslims. There's a very, very large ecosystem of different materials for different sorts of themes and issues. Then, in addition to that, there's obviously leadership statements. Lots of interesting stuff can be drawn from that from a more operational perspective. So they're handy to get a sense of where the Islamic State is from a policy perspective, from an insurgency perspective. Also understanding the history of the group and how it's functioned, how it's tried to navigate through the last couple of decades. They're a very useful repository for that. The medium that I'm most interested in currently is photography. I mean, not currently. It's been. I'm writing my PhD on it. It's been 4 years now, so it's been a long-term interest of mine. But just to give you a sense of scale, between the very end of 2015 and September 2017, this is just the sample I'm analysing for my PhD. So I know the figures just off the back of my mind. The Islamic State published 20,788 propaganda photographs from across Iraq and Syria, but also West Africa, Libya, Egypt, Afghanistan. Am I missing anywhere? A couple from Libya and a couple from the Caucasus as well, but a huge amount of material here. And thematically, the content conveyed in these 20,000 images, 5,460, I think, individual photo reports, is also, it varies hugely. So there's a large proportion of it, about 65%, focuses on conveying information about the Islamic State's war efforts. So primarily in Iraq and Syria, but elsewhere as well. So
battle pictures, yeah?
Yeah, so battle pictures, but also images from training camps, images of suicide bombers and suicide fighters prior to embarking on raids, but also the kind of eulogies as well. Images showing ghanima, so war spoils, so weapons and so on. Images showing other soldiers enemy soldiers being arrested, killed in various ways. And then a heck of a lot of images of corpses on the battlefield as well. Then there's the other 35%, which focuses on civilian life. So whether that's the kind of utopia of the caliphate itself. So there's 3 subsets of images, those focusing on the Islamic State's efforts at statehood, so governance, whether that's the provision of services or education or dispensation of welfare, zakat and so on, or whether that's the Islamic State nation. So this is focusing at the level of the individual, the ordinary Muslim living within the Islamic State back during that time. So there'd be a focus on religious life or recreation or commerce, agriculture, things that are essentially cast as a manifestation of what it is to live in the Islamic State. So conveying a sense of abundance and pristine security and so on. And then there's another smaller subset of images documenting the aftermath of airstrikes, which are all about compounding the enmity of the adversaries of the Islamic State, of non-Islam, of the forces of Kufr and so on and so forth. But anyway, in the grand scheme of things, these 20,000 images, they're photographs, yes, and they have ostensibly some sort of documentary function to them. They were and are often assumed to be kind of objects that document what is happening in the lands of the Islamic State. But more than that, they're actually very removed from material reality, in my opinion. I think every editorial decision that was made, even right down to the decisions made by the photographer at the point of the image being captured, it's a process by which the image itself is being divorced further and further from reality. That what we're seeing when they're being published is only a very small subset of what's actually taken by these photographers. And I think in essence, the image world that is depicted in the course of these many thousands of photographs is a very clear-cut and deliberate portrayal of what the Islamic State wants itself to be seen as, not what it actually is. So it's a kind of very clear manifestation of ideology and action, which I think is just fascinating. But yeah, I could talk about photographs for a very long time, as you might.
No, it's fascinating, and so all this, all this big picture of all these different outputs, the music, the photographs, the magazines, the videos, we can start to understand why the Islamic State has been depicted as a sort of totally unprecedented. As you said, I think at the very beginning of the call, a very unprecedented propaganda apparatus or system in terms of insurgent groups. So is that picture accurate? So I'm wondering, are they really, some people have called them geniuses of propaganda. So did they really invent out of the blue a full propaganda system like that? Or were they picking up inspiration from, previous groups that they compete against? Because surely we've had other groups publishing magazines before. We've had other groups using videos before. Maybe not the same type, or but what's your opinion on that? So both at once, it seems to be a genuinely unprecedented effort, but also on the other hand, they seem to be borrowing from ideas from the past and from their competitor groups. Is that an accurate kind of description?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's only unprecedented in terms of scale and quantity, and perhaps complexity in certain definitions of complexity, but it's not at all new in terms of the kind of undergirding principles behind why any of these materials are being made, nor is it new in terms of the kind of spectrum of content itself. I mean, there are huge amounts of things that are borrowed from both its rivals, but also just, I mean, this is an insurgent organization first and foremost. It's doing what other insurgents do, and it's engaging in outreach and influence operations for the very same reasons that the Viet Cong engaged in outreach and influence operations, and that's why there are so many parallels in that as well. And I mean, it's very much possible to trace various components of the Islamic State's media apparatus, but also its objectives as well, back across the last few decades to very highly conventional kind of principles of insurgency and asymmetric warfare. But also from a stylistic perspective, there has been a huge amount made of the Islamic State being slick or professional in the kinds of videos or photographs that it takes. I mean, primarily in the context of its videos. Yeah, it's good, but they're good amateurs. They're not necessarily of professional quality. And the highest profile things that are often kind of held aloft as examples of this, they are a minority. A very small minority out of a very large corpus of materials. But I mean, just going back to the subset of photography, I mean, the way that there's a very systematic and redundant way that the Islamic State charged its photographers to go out and capture things, similarly with its videographers as well. And the way that it portrays, for example, the ideal Islamic State soldier is very, very similar to how the ideal American Special Forces operative is portrayed in Hollywood. I mean, they're borrowing from a whole bunch of different things here. Many of them are from dominant Western visual culture. As well, and that's really, really fascinating. Similarly with the stuff looking at the Islamic State nation, idealizing that aspect of it, there's a huge focus on the ideal worker. I mean, that's very clear where that's come from. The kind of proclivity to capture images of industry and agriculture in action and a functioning state. I mean, this is all stuff which is, of course, on the one hand intuitive, but also the way that it's kind of been pasted together, stitched together into this broader narrative of what it is to live in a functioning revolutionary state. I mean, that's something that we saw a heck of a lot of in the course of the 20th century. So yeah, it's always borrowing, always learning, and crucially, other groups are borrowing and learning from it as well.
Oh, right. So there's some kind of snowball effect, and then yeah. Okay. I see the time running, unfortunately. So I'm going to have two more questions for you, if you're okay with that. So one would be in relation to your own work, because I see that you have and I've seen it. You have recently published a book that I found fascinating, which is a very specific book, together with Haroro Ingram and Craig Whiteside. It's called The ISIS Reader. It's quite atypical, right? Because you're not here. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about how this book is atypical and what we can find inside that book?
Sure. Yeah. So the ISIS Reader is I mean, it's building on a fairly substantial literature of analysis of the Islamic State and associated movements that has emerged over the course of the last couple of decades. There are now lots and lots of different books which try to explain and help the reader understand where the Islamic State came from, where it's going in the future, and how it got to be what it is today. But what myself, Craig, and Haroro wanted to do was to kind of focus more on the primary sources themselves. So essentially tell that same story, but through the eyes and from the perspective of the Islamic State itself. I mean, this is an organization which, yeah, may have become particularly well known in the last 5-6 years, but it goes back decades. I mean, the earliest text that we feature and analyze in the ISIS Reader is from the early 1990s. And it's a statement from Abu Musa Bazarqawi, given at just as he is being charged with terrorism offences back in Jordan, and that's why he kind of sets out his vision for what jihad is and what it should be about. And we feature, I think, 15 or 16 different texts going back from the 90s up to the end of 2019. And in the course of that, through the analysis that we append to each of the extracts, we hopefully tell a quite different story to that which is already been relayed by these other books of pure analysis, and one that kind of is different but kind of exists in parallel, that really does kind of get readers to focus more on what it is that this group has that has enabled it to become as sustainably effective as it has been for the last few decades. And I mean, yes, it's at a particularly low ebb as things stand now, even though people are talking about a resurgence of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and even though it's very dangerous and ascendant in West Africa, we're looking at a very different organization to where it was in 2013, 2014. And it was territorially defeated. The proto-state was defeated in Syria in March 2019. But nevertheless, the organization has managed to navigate through periods of hardship much worse than this in the past. And I think that was one of the main things that we wanted to convey through this book, that there's a kind of pedigree at work here, and it has the ability to, or it has the knowledge from past decades about how to get through very difficult times. And we hope that this book will give readers the ability to understand what we may see in the next few years as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very peculiar but fascinating book where, you know, you have these texts written by these people, right? And then you have the commentaries, and it really helps us to understand the evolution of thinking. And but also you're right to sort of trace back what we sometimes think as a group that just arrived out of the blue, but to trace back its evolution in time a bit further back, and to see through all these texts how you've had some changes in ideology, but also some continuity. So I think it's a very important volume that I wanted to highlight here. And we have to finish, so I will finish with the same two questions that I always ask. One which is about your research, and another one which would be a piece of advice to our audience. So in terms of your research, can you, and these are very brief answers that I'm looking for. Can you briefly tell us what you're currently working on, and what you are, what are you working on right now, and why do you think that's important? And then also, the other question is a piece of advice. What would be the one book on extremism that you would advise our audience to go and pick up and read?
Oof.
That's a tough question, and you can't cite the ISIS reader.
Damn, you got me there. So I'm currently working on West Africa. Especially trying to understand the conflict dynamic in northeastern Nigeria, and how the Islamic State's province there, Wilayat Gharb Ifriqiya, West Africa province, is doing. So, I mean, from the amount of activities that are being reported on a day-to-day basis, it pales in significance to in comparison to Iraq and Syria, for example. But from a lethality perspective, the scale of the operations that are being conducted by this affiliate is 5-6 times more impactful than those which are happening in Iraq and Syria. So something big is going down in northeast Nigeria, and it's something which the Islamic State centrally is trying to get a lot of people to focus on. Consistently getting highlighted in its propaganda, and that's something that I'm trying to understand better and get a clearer sense of how that relationship is facilitated. For the second question, I think one which there are two books which have really stuck with me. I've read them ages ago now, but I continue to think about them a lot. Neither of which are kind of directly related to extremism. They were written decades ago, but they are very relevant to extremism, and also the way that we consume information today, and the way that ideology kind of enacts itself within society today. So the first would be The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, and the second is Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitude by Jacques Ellul. So the two of them are, I think, very, very useful reading to get a sense of how political movements, potentially extremist political movements, but not necessarily, how they attempt to shape the information environment around their potential supporters and their supporters and their members in order to achieve political effect. And I'd really recommend each of them to whoever's interested in this sort of thing.
Well, okay, excellent. Well, thank you. And we have to call it a day, but that was a very fascinating interview with lots of information to digest here. And so I have to thank you again for being present here, and I wish you good luck with all that new work.
Thank you very much. Great to chat.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language, and incite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet,
to ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility.